Welcome to What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. This week, we're diving into something everyone is complaining about, the soaring cost of food. Average grocery store prices have increased as much as 25% since 2020.
Well, they're definitely higher, and which is sad because a lot of people are struggling.
They're horrible. Like, no reason we should be paying that much for food right now. Absolutely not.
Currently, the grocery prices are exceeding our ability to have a normal living, and I think they're also contributing to having to make other decisions on how we're going to continue feeding ourselves, like having a garden. But of course, not all of us have the ability to have a garden.
Despite reports that inflation is cooling, we're still seeing outrageous prices and hearing terms like greedflation and shrinkflation being thrown around daily. How is it possible that we are still paying more for less? Even President Biden is frustrated his favorite snack is dwindling in size and growing in cost.
And as an ice cream lover, what makes me the most angry is that ice cream cartons have actually shrunk in size, but not in price. I've had enough of what they call shrinkflation. It's a ripoff.
Now, the president is not alone. We heard from people across the country who are not so happy about this little thing called shrinkflation.
The cereal boxes are smaller and they cost, seems like, twice as much, but you're getting less. So it just feels like I'm being robbed. And I don't like being robbed.
Chips, really, what I was noticed more, just really smaller bags.
Everything's much smaller. When you go like get a steak, right? It's like maybe like a 1 ounce. So yeah, everything's much smaller.
Until now, the White House has been criticized for sky-high food prices, but the blame game seems to be shifting from the commander-in-chief to what some Americans say are greedy corporations. According to a new Navigator research poll, 59% of Americans think corporate greed is the major cause of elevated sticker prices. We hear a lot about the high prices of meats and eggs, but according to the USDA, the top 3 highest prices increase in 2023 were of fats and oils, sugars and sweets, and cereal and bakery products. Here to break down what's really going on here is NewsNation business contributor Gary B. Smith. Gary, thank you so much for being here and taking the time. This is certainly a topic I get asked about all the time, but I have so many questions myself.
Sure. My pleasure, Julia.
So to start off with, we keep hearing this term greedflation. Just break down what that actually means.
Okay. Well, one, this is a term 99% of the time used by politicians. 2, it is basically saying that corporations are charging above and beyond what they should charge consumers for the products they sell. Since we're talking about grocery items, it'd be instead of charging $4 for a box of checks, they charge $4.25 for a box of checks.
Right. So, we've heard the argument that greedflation or, these changes that these corporations are making could lead to innovation and changes in the market. How does that happen exactly?
Yeah, exactly. For people that complain about greedflation, if you will, they don't understand economics. I'm sorry. That sounds, for everyone complaining about high food prices, and I'm one of them. I don't like paying more money for high food prices. But in order for companies to innovate, they need profits. In order to attract competitors, they need to see that they can make a large amount of money. For example, let's just say Coke was the only one out there and they could charge $10 a bottle for Coke.
Right.
Someone's going to scratch their head and say, wait a second, if I am RC Cola, to use one from the past, and I can charge $9 a bottle for similar tasting soda, I'm going to enter that market. They do. And then what happens? Coke has to reduce their prices. Other competitors are attracted. That's why we have so many choices in the supermarket to begin with.
Right. So we talked about greedflation. What about shrinkflation? Break down what that means.
I think shrinkflation is a little bit more insidious, if you will, because what companies do is they take the same package, if you will, and they either put less in it or they shrink the package and charge the same. So people walking up and say, I'm still getting my same box of cereal, and I'm still paying, whatever it is, $4.50. And they think, okay, well, that hasn't changed. But when they look closely and they say, oh, wait a second, I'm getting a half ounce less in my box, really they're paying more.
So to be clear, we're not imagining this, because it seems like a bag of chips these days is like, what, 50% air, 50% if that chips?
I'm not sure it's 50%, but yes, along those lines, the staples that you get can often, I won't say always, can often be more filled with air, if you will.
So which products are the biggest culprits when it comes to shrinkflation?
Well, it's normally the products that people don't pay a lot of attention to, and that are staples: toilet paper, snacks, cereal, candy, things like that. People just scoop off the shelf. People are always going to scrutinize what a pound of veal is going to be, or 2 pounds of chuck roast. But they're going to say, look, my kids like Cheerios. I'm going to get the Cheerios regardless. I'm going to get the toilet paper. I always bought Charmin. I'm going to get it. I throw it into the cart, and then all of a sudden you say, wait a second. It's either not going as far, or I'm paying more per ounce, if you will.
So turning to the public policy portion of this, Washington says they're going to put a stop to corporate greed, but can they actually even do that?
I hope not. I mean, this has been tried. I don't want to date either of us, but I remember when Nixon had the whip inflation now. We had price control, or maybe it was Ford had whip inflation now. Nixon had price controls. These things never work. It's going against the fabric of capitalism. You want choices. You want more choices. You want eventual lower prices. You have to have competition in there. It's trying to limit what companies can make is a terrible idea.
Right. So it's easy to tell when you're not getting a dozen eggs, but what tricks are being used to dupe people into not noticing the smaller size with other food products?
Well, they keep the same size and they package less in there. Stuff like toilet paper actually has less sheets. A yogurt cup have the same size but has less ounces in there. So all the normal tricks that, if you were given a half day to think of, you'd come up with, that's what these supermarket sellers are doing.
So it seems like these supermarket sellers are sort of, appearing to skirt the corners, cut corners, if you will, with trying to make products smaller. But how can consumers fight back and essentially get more bang for their buck at the grocery store?
Well, I like to think I'm ground zero for that, because I do weekly shopping, sometimes multiple times a week with my wife, and we've done a few things. One, don't be afraid to switch supermarkets. Look, in our area in Florida, Publix is the biggie, but you know what? Winn-Dixie is cheaper and for the same quality. Two, take advantage if the supermarket has loyalty programs. Winn-Dixie has one. Over time, that adds up. So every few weeks, you find, wow, I have $100 worth of free groceries because I'm a loyalty member. Three, if you see items that you like on sale, for example, President Biden likes ice cream. Winn-Dixie has a very good premium brand ice cream, but if it's BOGO, pick up more ice cream than you normally would and put it in the freezer. Another way to save. Fourth, and this is probably the most important, scrutinize the labels in the supermarket. They always give cost per ounce. So you can compare and contrast just about everything in there and say, oh, wait a second, this looks like it's cheaper, but I'm actually paying more per ounce. If you're a smart shopper, I'm telling you, week in, week out, you can save $25, $50, even $100.
Just to wrap this up, when can we expect prices to go back to normal, or are we living in the new normal when it comes to smaller packages and higher prices?
Well, it's funny, Julie. I always think of what is normal? Is normal? We're supposed to go back to 50 cents a gallon gasoline, or supposed to go back to $1 for a box of cereal? Everyone's normal is different. I guess what we're really asking is, when can we say, oh, I guess prices are reasonable? I guess when they come down to what they were, considering inflation, and that'll probably going to take about a year or two before they're back down to rising as inflation would. For example, what do people consider normal now with gasoline is $3 a gallon normal for gasoline? I guess it depends on, where you've been and where you think we're going. But I would say all that, mumbo jumbo in there, probably a year or so.
Yeah, what is normal? Gosh, we could do an entire episode of this show on what is normal. We live in very interesting times. But Gary B. Smith, thank you so much for breaking it down with us today.
My pleasure, Julia. Thank you.
Nikki Haley renews her vows to stay in the race.
I refuse to quit. South Carolina will vote on Saturday. But on Sunday, I'll still be running for president. I'm not going anywhere.
And the presidential hopeful isn't slowing down her David and Goliath battle, going full steam ahead into South Carolina.
He's gotten more unstable and unhinged. He spends more time in courtrooms than he does on the campaign trail.
We have a competitor, a bird brain, who is getting decimated. With your support, we're going to rocket the Republican nomination.
But her chances continue to look slim to none, trailing Trump by over 30%. It's time to go on the record with Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, as always, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So to start, Scott, Nikki Haley's presidential ambitions are keeping her going. But in reality, what does she actually need to do to pick up enough delegates to secure the nomination?
Quite frankly, she needs a miracle. You saw that GOP South Carolina primary average. She's losing her home state, a state in which she has won before as governor by 30 points. The map doesn't look much better for her as we approach Super Tuesday, where there's more than 10 states on the ballot. She thinks she might have a chance in Texas or California to pick up some delegates because you can still win some delegates by not winning the entire state. But unless there is a once in a million polling error here, all the polls point to she's basically has no path to the nomination delegate wise.
So turning to another national story, Alabama is making big news after ruling frozen embryos are children. Nikki Haley quickly sided with that decision. Scott, how could this issue impact the 2024 election?
Well, what's interesting is we had some issues in 2023 around abortion and all the derivative issues around that. And this is one of those, or at least that's what the Democrats are going to make it out to be. And we saw that this issue, abortion and things around pro-life and things around these types of issues, increased Democratic turnout. We saw that in Ohio, where there was a measure that was going to support abortion, kind of go against Roe v. Wade. And we saw record turnout in Ohio. I think we're going to see that affect Democratic turnout throughout the rest of the year. We're certainly seeing it in fundraising. It was interesting what Nikki Haley said on that, because she was the one who stuck out a position in the Republican primary a little bit more moderate on abortion issues. And in this one, she came out pretty firmly on the pro-life side. So we'll see how that plays. It's certainly in the GOP primary where she needs to win the voters. But, how Donald Trump deals with it and how the Republicans deal with it throughout the rest of the year will be interesting, because it is a motivating issue for the Democrats.
Yeah, we'll absolutely be watching that issue. And speaking of Trump, Decision Desk's presidential prediction map has Trump clearing the board right now. How do those numbers look, and what states have flipped, and how is the data backing this up?
Well, it's interesting. It's very early in the general election calendar. We're not even technically out of the primary season yet. But we look at states like Michigan, we look at states like Wisconsin, even Minnesota, which you got a light blue there. There are a lot of states with Donald Trump, at least in the early polling, he is actually doing better than he was in 2020. Now, we're still a long way away from Election Day, but early polling shows that he's got a lead on Donald Trump in some of these key states he's going to need to win to actually pull out a win against Joe Biden this time.
You're right. We're certainly a long way from Election Day, but we know that there's been lots of news surrounding the two frontrunners, Trump and Biden. And, Trump's legal losses are continuing to pile up, totaling to over $500 million, and that's after interest. And the president's brother, James Biden, just testified that the president had no direct or indirect financial interest in his business ventures. Do you think we're seeing any reaction to these cases regarding Trump and Biden in the polling?
Yes, but in two different ways. At least on the Trump stuff, it helps him in the Republican primary. Republican primary voters tend to look at these verdicts and these trials as it's the world against him, and so they kind of rallies his support. I wouldn't say the same about independent voters and Donald Trump in his court cases, but certainly among Republican voters right now, his court cases are at least mildly helpful in fundraising. Joe Biden, on the other hand, this is not good news for him simply because it doesn't allow him to talk about the economy, which is an issue he needs to improve on if he's going to win this November. And while, it's his brother and not him, this is not something that he wants to be talking about this week or weeks into the campaign.
You're right, it turns the direction away from those issues, and instead he's having to respond to questions about his brother. But you brought up fundraising, and we've seen a significant disparity in fundraising efforts between Trump and Biden, Republicans and Democrats. Can you talk a little about those numbers and what they mean for both campaigns going forward?
Well, it's interesting. We're in the first 2 months, almost 2 months into the year, and so we get some pretty good fundraising numbers and peek into what both the presidential campaigns are doing, what the supporting national committees are doing, and what some of the supporting House and Senate committees are doing. And it's pretty clear the Democrats have significant cash advantages across the board. If just looking at the presidential side, Donald Trump actually spent more money in the last 45 days than he raised. Now, he's still got tens of millions of dollars in the bank, but that's not where you want to be if you're trying to clinch a nomination and build a war chest. Joe Biden, on the other hand, had a pretty healthy January, raising over $30 million and adding to his war chest while his expenses are low. Again, many months to go on the fundraising side, but this is the time where you need to be stacking the money, not burning it as Donald Trump is doing.
Right. And moving to foreign policy, President Biden just hit Russia with new sanctions after Alexei Navalny died in prison last week. Trump continues to play softball on the issue. Are Americans divided on Russia, or do you think this could impact Trump's chances going into November?
Well, interestingly enough, the support for the war in Ukraine among the U.S. has waned a little bit. It's still slightly above 50% in terms of do people support what we're doing over there, but it's off of its high in the mid-60s when the war initially started. Alexei Navalny certainly got a lot of press, very sympathetic to the voters in America. And so I imagine when we start seeing some polling on it later this week, we're going to see an uptick in support for the war in Ukraine and obviously more awareness around Russia. Where it could be interesting is we see Donald Trump comparing himself to Alexei Navalny in terms of his persecution or his claimed persecution around court cases. So we'll see what mix up that has and how that affects the polls. But it certainly muddies the water a little bit.
So staying with the Russia issue, Trump's beating up on NATO once again. The former president has been on the attack recently, saying this.
When I came in, I didn't make a speech. I looked at the numbers. I said, these numbers are terrible. Nobody's paying their bills. And I told them that. And then I came back 6 months later. I said, now you've had time. But one of the heads of the country stood up and said, does that mean that if we don't pay the bills, that you're not going to protect us? I said, that's exactly what it means. Exactly. I'm not going to protect you.
But a new poll by Redfield and Wilton Strategies following Trump's threats showed that 64% of voters support NATO. Scott, do you think these attacks could ultimately divide GOP voters?
Yes, they could, because actually it's funny. Obviously, that poll is of all registered voters or all likely voters. But when you look at how that line and how that viewpoint plays among GOP voters, they love that, especially how he says it. The GOP thinks that, hey, if you're not paying for it, we shouldn't support you. I don't know that if there was ever a very serious threat to NATO that you would see those people actually support not helping out our NATO partners. But right now, that line is this cycle's version of let's build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. I don't know that the voters believe that it'll happen exactly that way, but they like that sentiment. So it helps them on the GOP side. But as you've shown, it's unclear whether it helps him on the independent or Democratic voters, which he's going to need at least those independents coming this fall.
Scott, it's only February, and we have so much more longer to go until November. Thank you, as always, for making sense of this crazy news cycle with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. One area where Americans aren't divided: if NATO countries are attacked by Russia, should the U.S. help defend them? 75% of Americans say yes. Here to make sense of Trump's threats and who should be paying what when it comes to NATO is The Hill staff writer Raphael Bernal.
President Trump has made a sport of mixing up NATO's budget and its military spending guidelines. The bottom line is NATO suggests its members spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. It's a guideline and not a mandate. For years, many of NATO's European members fell short of that goal, mostly because they didn't feel the threat of foreign military attacks. Needling NATO allies on the issue, though, is political gold for Trump, who gets to at once call for more military spending and to rile up his anti-globalist base. So NATO was formed in 1949 with 12 members, and then it slowly added Turkey and Greece in 1952, West Germany in 1955, Spain in 1982, and a whole reunified Germany in 1990. That's when things got dicey. To get the Soviets to agree to the unification of Germany, US officials told Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand further, but they never signed a formal deal to that effect. But then the Soviet Union collapsed and communist countries in Eastern Europe turned to democracy and to NATO. Russia's old allies were quick to turn away for good reason. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union created its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, to counter NATO. When the Soviet Union had disagreements with its allies, well, it had a tendency to resolve some of those disagreements aggressively. In the 1990s, Eastern Europeans looked west to modernize, grow their economies, and escape their communist past. But some countries, like the three Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, they joined NATO out of fear. And that fear turned out to be well-founded when Russia invaded Ukraine, another ex-Soviet country that wanted to join NATO. So it might be Trump's threats or Russian President Vladimir Putin's aggression, but European military spending has gone way up. According to the alliance, 18 member nations are expected to hit that 2% figure in 2024.
That's it for What's America Thinking. Come back next week and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And we want to hear from you. Leave your comments and let us know what's on your mind.